Hello and welcome to the beginnings of Catholicism in English colonial America. I'm Father Charles Connor from Mount St. Mary's Seminary in Emmitsburg, Maryland, and I am delighted to welcome you to this new series, a series which is being filmed entirely on location here in Catholic Southern Maryland. This really and truly is where the Catholic Church began in the United States, and we are starting this first episode on St. Clement's Island, where the first Mass was offered in what would become the United States of America. Now, let me begin by explaining a very, very important point. We are not speaking about the Spanish settlement of Florida, which was earlier. We are not speaking about the French settlement of New England, Canada, and Canada coming down into New England, which was earlier. We are speaking rather about the 13 colonies that became the nucleus of the United States of America. The 13 colonies which officially declared their independence from England, the mother country, in 1796. Those 13 colonies which formed themselves into the Confederation government for nearly a decade, and those same colonies which ultimately came into effect under the new federal Constitution in 1789 and selected George Washington of Virginia to be the first president of the United States. The same year, incidentally, when John Carroll was selected to be the first Roman Catholic bishop in the United States. John Carroll, a native of Maryland. So here we are on St. Clement's Island. We are in St. Mary's County in southern Maryland. We are at the heart of English Catholicism in what became the United States of America. We are on some of the holiest ground, and from the point of view of the Catholic perspective, I think we can say we are on the holiest ground in the 13 colonies, at least the holiest Catholic ground in the 13 colonies. It was on this very island where we stand that Father Andrew White, an English Jesuit, offered the holy sacrifice of the Mass for the first time in the British colonies. It is an extremely important series, my dear friends, because our Catholic people do not know the origins of our heritage in the United States. Most of our Catholic people are not cognizant of the fact that it all began in colonial Maryland. It all began with the Calvert family. Religious toleration began with them. Catholicism coming to the British colonies began with them. And the religious toleration that they extended to everyone was denied to them ultimately in a few decades when Oliver Cromwell took over and the period of the Protectorate and the Commonwealth had begun in England. The toleration that Catholics extended was indeed taken away, if you will, from those very Catholics who had extended it in the first place. So this is one of the most important segments of land in the United States of America where we could be filming an on-location series for the Eternal Word television network. This is where Catholicism began in British colonial America. This is where the colonists first landed. This is where the first Mass was said. And everything starts from St. Clement's Island in St. Mary's County in southern Maryland. St. Mary's County, which was named for our Blessed Mother. To understand, then, the significance of what happened here on St. Clement's Island, we are going to begin our story over in England. Well, we go back now to a gentleman by the name of George Calvert, and our story takes us into the 16th century. George Calvert was a Yorkshireman, a very, very famous 16th century British pedigree, if you will. He traveled extensively, studied at Oxford, was well known to all the British nobility of the day and so forth, and rose very, very, very quickly in governmental circles in England. He received the help of a number of influential patrons, and he really, for the first time, came to the notice of King James I. He really was one of King James's closest advisors, and he was a man who was absolutely fascinated with the idea of colonization. He wanted to bring a lot of wealthy Britishers together and form a colonizing effort in what would be called a proprietary colony. Now remember, we had royal colonies, we had proprietary colonies, and we had charter colonies in English colonial America. And so the governmental system would differ in most of these places. But in the proprietary colonies, we find that the proprietor was the one who had been given the grant of land and also governmental rights by the British Crown, whoever the ruling monarch was at the time. So George Calvert approached King James I with an idea that he wanted to colonize people, but his original idea was to go to Newfoundland up in Canada. And he envisioned the idea of calling this colony Avalon. He and his wife went and visited the area, and he found that ultimately, geographically, and most particularly as regards the climate in Newfoundland, it just wasn't going to work. These Britishers who were used to one particular climate in England saw the intensity, the fierceness, the harshness of Canadian winters, and they knew very, very well that they simply were not going to last. A colonizing expedition might last for a year, it might last for 2 years, but it would last for no longer if the thing became a permanent enterprise in Canada. And so therefore, while the thought was a very, very encouraging one, nonetheless, it never came about, primarily for practical reasons. But there's something far, far more important in this story than just simply the colonizing efforts in Canada not working out. What is very, very important in this story is a personal decision that George Calvert made in his own life. George Calvert, at a given period of time, and the year has always been somewhat disputed among historians, but he made a decision in his own life based on any number of factors. The decision he made was one of the worst mortal sins one could commit in England. He became a Roman Catholic. Now, that was a horrendous blunder. And people who went so public with their conversion to Catholicism were in very, very, very serious trouble in England. We do have a group of Catholics called the recusants in England, coming from the Latin term recuso, that is to say, I refuse. I refuse to go to the Church of England. I refuse to pay tithes to the Church of England and all the rest. And the recusants, as long as they kept quiet, as long as they kept far distant from London, as far as they did not make waves, generally speaking, were left alone. And there were a number of very wealthy, influential Catholic families who were left alone and whose Catholicism did indeed perdure for many, many generations. Well, Calvert was not keeping quiet about this. Quite the contrary, he was going public, and he knew, George Calvert knew very well what his decision was going to cost him. He knew he was going to have to resign as one of the secretaries of state. He knew he was going to resign the Privy Council. He knew he was going to have to give up many, if not all, of the privileges that he had enjoyed at court for so long. Why did he do it? Here was a man who really and truly had everything going for him. You could say Calvert was at the top of the heap in England. And yet he let it all go. He converted to the Church of Rome. Or I should say he reverted, because obviously the family had been Catholic and many of them had fallen away at the time of the Reformation. Well, historians once again have speculated for a long period of time on just why he did it. Perhaps it was his Spanish contacts. There was much contact between England and Spain for a variety of political and social reasons, mostly political, but he had many Spanish Catholic contacts in the city of London who may very well have encouraged him to come back to the true faith. It might have been the sudden, unexpected death of his wife that brought him back to the true faith. It may have simply been personal introspection, realizing, here's where I am, here's where I know I should be, and yet I'm not there. Remember how respected Calvert was. King James I had already granted him a barony in County Longford in Ireland. Calvert already had the title Lord Baltimore. And here he was giving it all away. He became a Catholic, and yet King James I did not lose the respect for George Calvert that he always had. In fact, there was always, in each one of the Stuart monarchs, there was always a strong Catholic streak. And because of the great, great regard that King George I had for George Calvert, he very quickly, very easily responded very positively to Calvert's request for another proprietary venture. And this proprietary venture was to come into the Chesapeake Bay area. And so, because of the fact that he was as well respected as he was able to gather about him a number of very wealthy individuals, both Catholic and Protestant, who were going to make their way to the New World, to the Chesapeake, to the Palatinate of Maryland, to this geographic locale where we are standing right now. And they began that journey in the fall of 1633, and they continued what was a very, very perilous journey. We're going to trace the route of that journey now in just a moment, and we're going to talk about some very interesting gentlemen who joined the expedition to Maryland, not in Grasmond, England, where the Ark and the Dove sailed from originally. And these three gentlemen are particularly interesting because two of them were Roman Catholic Jesuit priests, namely Father Andrew White and Father John Altham, and one was a Catholic Jesuit brother, namely Brother Thomas Gervais. Stay with us, and we'll tell you more of the story. Welcome back to our first episode on the beginnings of Catholicism in English colonial America. We are here once again on St. Clement's Island in St. Mary's County in southern Maryland, an island which back in the 17th century when the British Catholics landed here in 1634 was probably 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 times larger than it is today. The island in those days extended all the way to the shore, to what is called Colton's Point, where we will be visiting in our next episode. And so it was a much, much larger island in those days, but what is kept here today is just so beautifully, beautifully reminiscent about what happened here in 1634 when the Holy Sacrifice of the Mass was offered here on St. Clement's Island. Now, to come back to our story, remember the two Jesuit priests, Father Andrew White and Father John Altham, and a Jesuit brother, Thomas Gervais, joined the colonizing expedition and traveled over on the Dove, one of the two ships. Father White is usually referred to as the Apostle of Maryland. He was a remarkable individual. You know, he worked here in southern Maryland with the Piscataway Indians, and not only did he work with them, but he actually wrote a catechism in the Piscataway language. And that was copied, of course, and it was many of the fellow Jesuits who would join his group here in southern Maryland in subsequent years picked up from his knowledge. Father White taught himself the dialect of these Indians so that he could convert them, and ultimately, Father White received into the church the chief of the Piscataway Indian tribe and his wife and his family, and baptized them here in southern Maryland. Well, they sailed from Cowes after the Jesuits had joined the expedition. Father White kept a remarkable journal from the fall of 1633 until the spring of 1634 when they arrived here on St. Clement's Island in southern Maryland. And this is what he writes. On the 22nd of November, 1633, St. Cecilia's Day, with a southwest wind softly blowing, we sailed from Cowes, which is a port on the Isle of Wight. After we had placed the main parts of the ship under the protection of God first, and then of His Most Holy Mother, and of St. Ignatius Loyola, and all the angels of Maryland, we sailed for a short time between the two shores. When the wind was failing us, we cast anchor opposite Yarmouth Castle, which is situated toward the northwest of the same island. Here we were received with public cannon salutes, and yet fear was not absent, for the sailors were muttering among themselves. They were muttering among themselves that they were expecting a messenger and a letter from London, and for that very reason they also seemed to be devising delays. Now, why would they devise delays? Purely and simply because they wanted to persecute the Catholics who were trying to get out of England. That's the reason. The hostility was terrible, and Maryland was going to offer the refuge. But God destroyed their evil plans. Indeed, that very night, when a favorable but powerful wind was blowing, a French cutter, which had moored into the same port together with us, was forced to sail and came close to running into our pinnacle, the Dove. Therefore, the latter, having cut away and lost one anchor, set sail as fast as possible in order not to be crushed. And since it was a dangerous place to drift, she hurried out to sea. And so, lest we might lose sight of our pinnacle, we decided to follow. In this way, the plans that the sailors considered against us were foiled. This happened on the 23rd of November, the Feast of St. Clement. The Feast of St. Clement, St. Clement's Island, and how it got its name. St. Clement, who obtained the crown of martyrdom when he was tied to an anchor and plunged into the sea, and showed to the people of the earth how they might narrate the wonderful works of God. Well, the voyage continued, of course, through the Leeward Islands, the Virginia Capes, and I should tell you, too, that George Calvert died shortly before this proprietary expedition to Maryland. It fell to his son Cecil Calvert to actually take the reins, if you will, the proprietary reins of the Palatinate of Maryland from his father. And for a number of personal reasons that came into play in Cecil Calvert's life, he himself did not make the voyage over here on either the Ark or the Dove, but rather it passed to his brother Leonard Calvert, who actually became the first resident proprietor in the Palatinate of Maryland. Now, this was it was anything but an easy journey coming from England to the United States, or coming from England to colonial America. Listen to what Father White tells us. This storm, a very big one, kindled the prayers and vows of the Catholics in honor of the Most Blessed Virgin Mother and of her Immaculate Conception, of St. Ignatius, the patron saint of Maryland, of St. Michael, and of all the guardian angels of that country, the new country they were coming to. And everyone was hastening to purify his soul through the sacrament of penance. God knows we've gotten away from the sacrament of penance today, but these English Catholics knew the great, great value of the beautiful sacrament of penance. For when we had lost control over the rudder, the vessel, abandoned to the waves and winds, soon tossed about like a quoit until God opened a path for her safety. In the beginning, Father White says, I admit that the fear of losing the ship and of losing my life had seized me. But then I devoted some time to prayer, less tepid than in my usual manner. You don't think of men like Father White being tepid in prayer, but he obviously was. And I proposed to the Lord Christ, to the Most Blessed Virgin, to St. Ignatius, and to all the angels of Maryland, that the purpose of this voyage was to honor the blood of our Redeemer through the salvation of the savages, to erect a kingdom for the Savior, if he considered our feeble efforts worthy of assistance, to consecrate another gift to the Immaculate Virgin Mother, and many similar things. After this, a great consolation shone inside my soul. And at the same time, such a firm conviction arose that we were to be rescued, not only from this, but from every other storm on this voyage. And there was no room for doubt in me any longer. I had given myself to prayer when the sea raged most severely, and may this be to the glory of God alone. I had barely finished when I perceived that the storm subsided. So, my good people, we had two Jesuit priests, a Jesuit brother, Leonard Calvert, Catholics whose names you will hear in future episodes, many, many people filled with the fullness of the Catholic faith. Catholics were showing and giving a tremendously good example to their fellow travelers on the Ark and the Dove. Now, when we come to our next episode, we are going to come to the conclusion of this journey with Father White, share some of his closing thoughts, and begin to start talking about the developments of Catholic life in Maryland, all of which stemmed from right here on this hallowed ground, St. Clement's Island, St. Mary's County, Southern Maryland. Please join us for our next episode.